Welcome to Transform Now, brought to you by SSNC, where we explore the future of work through the lens of AI. Across industries, leaders are rethinking strategy, culture, and operations to harness AI's full potential. This podcast gives you the insights and ideas to transform your organization, stay competitive, and thrive in a world driven by change. Let's get into the show.
Welcome to the Transform Now podcast. I'm your host, Michael Marchuk, and in this episode, we'll be chatting with Travis Hahler, author of the book Rethink Resistance, and this is a really amazing book. Travis is a change and transformation leader whose work focuses on the human experience, leaders how they manage that, with ultimately the adoption as the main key focus of how he addresses this. His background spans large-scale transformation efforts where understanding brain science, behavior, and emotion is as critical as strategy and execution. Travis is known for translating neuroscience into practical insights leaders can actually use through his Neuroscience of Change keynote to more than 25,000 leaders across 150 global events. And while I haven't seen one, I did read this book, and you are spot on with this stuff, by the way. His work is both research-informed and highly practical for audiences navigating constant organizational change. Anyone hear of AI? That's what we're heading today. So today we're going to be exploring a lot more about what this means, how the brain is involved here, and why so many change programs are tough to get through. So welcome, Travis.
Thank you so much, Michael. I appreciate the intro.
I'm super happy to have you on here because, like I said, after I read this book, I'm like, oh man, I can't wait to talk with this guy. But for everyone else who doesn't know you, can you introduce yourself?
Absolutely. So as you mentioned, Travis Hahler, by day, I am the Senior Director of Global Strategy and Transformation at Salesforce. I lead large-scale enterprise transformation work across global organizations as well as my own. I've been in the space for a little over 15 years and had the chance to work with over 100 companies, most of which are within the Fortune 500. And, you know, it's been interesting. My background is a little different and a little unusual than a lot of people's. It's in psychology, neuroscience, business. But really what's kind of driven me in my career has been this thing I continue to notice as I was working with customers and working with large companies is that change efforts that I was a part of that worked better, you know, it was really where we stopped treating resistance as a people problem and started treating it actually as information. And that's the basis and the foundation for the book you mentioned, Michael, Rethink Resistance. And really the core idea is pretty simple. It's all about your biology. And especially now, as you mentioned with the AI automation, it's changing how work gets done, how people feel, how leaders manage. It's changing everything. And so it's really an exciting time in this revolution of kind of work and everything else, but it's also a scary time. And so it's very meaningful to be able to talk to companies and leaders about that transition and what people are up against.
Well, you are not wrong. It is a very tumultuous time for folks looking at change in front of them. But you argue that resistance really isn't a mindset problem. It's tied to biology. So what's actually happening in the brain the moment the senior leader of your organization says, we're going to have some changes around here, especially when it comes to AI?
Yeah, it's kind of top of mind for a lot of companies right now. So very timely. I think the best way that I can describe it really is most leaders, they kind of stand up and they make that announcement, as you mentioned. And on the slide and on the presentation, you know, it makes sense, right? You look at it, you're like, all right, it seems strategic. It seems like it's well thought out. You know, everyone's going to go with it, right? But when I talk about resistance being biology, what I'm really getting at is the fact that the brain is designed to protect us from threat. It's to conserve our energy. It's to return to what's familiar when things feel overwhelming or we feel like we don't know exactly where things are going. So the moment that change is actually announced, what's happening is that multiple systems in our brain activate and they scan for threat, they scan for familiarity, they scan for loss, they scan for all these different things that the brain is essentially trying to say, am I still safe after this thing has changed? And that's what we're so, I guess, up against as humans, is that from a leader perspective, we're really bringing that, here's the change and we bring you the logic. From the human side, receiving it, we're thinking, what does this mean and am I still safe? And so that's really what I mean about resistance isn't a people problem, it's a biological problem. And that's just the way that we're wired and hardwired as humans.
So one of the examples that in your book that I really found insightful was the fact that everyone drives somewhere, right? Then you're driving along, and if you're commuting, generally speaking, your brain's on autopilot, right? You go the same route every day, you do your same thing every day, and you really don't necessarily have to pay that close of attention because your brain sort of has that muscle memory of this is where I turn, this is where I do, this is where it gets slow here, I need to slow down here because I know traffic's gonna be bad. You kind of understand this stuff. But when you introduce something like a construction detour, now your brain has to really perk up and really pay attention, which is very different than that kind of mindless commute home. So when you're seeing this kind of change from an AI perspective, someone says, hey, we have an AI change in your organization, and we're now going to bring in AI agents, and you're going to help train them and help manage them. Is that sort of the same thing that kind of goes on?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's one of my favorite examples because everyone can really, think about that as being very true. And if you kind of put it in perspective, so if we think about, there's really two sides to how the brain perceives change. One is around energy, and the other one's around protection. Energy really has to do with routines and relearning. And so what you're describing is this process of, yeah, my drive to and from work, easy, it's automated. The brain is hardwired it. It's just what you do. The minute you have to break away from that, you engage different areas of your brain that take a lot of energy and consume a lot of your energy to do that. And so it's really difficult to spend highly focused time on something that's brand new. So if you think about AI and, kind of the way that we've introduced it in what I would consider to be a lot of like starts and stops, right? Like we'll do very, very dedicated training on something AI related, whether it's an hour or two of a lunch and learn, or sometimes we're doing week long, we're going to come together and do hackathons and AI this and AI that. That's a lot for your brain to process all at once and to stay focused on. And so you're really moving from, here are all the routines I've built. You're asking me to rethink every single thing I've ever done. Oh my gosh, like I don't have that capacity to think through all of these things. And it becomes really overwhelming and really exhausting for us as humans in our brains.
So part of the things you highlighted is vulnerability, empathy, honesty. These are all like critical leadership qualities. Why do those matter more than strategy in times of change?
That's a great question, Michael. I think for me, and what I've seen at companies is the fact that a lot of the time, it's not necessarily that the strategy is wrong. It's not necessarily that the way that we're doing it is wrong or incorrect. What really tends to be the sticking point for a lot of people is loss. And I do talk about that a lot in the book. And there's really three types of loss that people experience at work. And it's competence, it's your relationships, and it's your control. And, if you think about something like AI, it's threatening all three all at the same time, right? And so when I talk about the need for empathy and vulnerability, the only way that people get through loss is through that empathy. It's through people understanding, it's through validation, it's through people helping a person think through their own loss. It's not usually solving the problem for them at all, right? We think about grief. No one can solve grief for you, but they can be there while you do it yourself. And I think that's the most important part. And so as leaders, this is really, I would say, a difficult thing for leaders to lean into because vulnerability feels scary as a leader. I think a lot of leaders think that I'm supposed to know everything and no one's ever supposed to see me, kind of be shaken. And then, empathy is something that I think we touched with a, broomstick length, right? Where we're like, I'll be empathetic, but only to a point where then once I get a little too empathetic, it feels too personal and not professional enough and not business enough. And so we got to keep it at that arm's length. But those are really the only ways that we help people through loss. And every single change equals loss. And that's the one takeaway I always tell every audience member that I'm speaking to is, if you don't leave here with any other thing, there's two things. One, change is a biological problem. And two, every change equals loss. So those are the two main things, and that's the reality of change.
So before we get to this next question, which I really want to get to, which is sort of the neurological components, some people may be really excited about something new while others see it differently. So you may have your CEO, for example, looks at something, they've seen something, they've connected the dots in their mind about what a future state, at least in their mind, might look like, kind of outside the bounds of any reality of where the corporation is right now, the organization is right now, where the people are right now and whatnot. They see the potential, the future state for that, and they're excited. They're driven. They see a passion for this. Like, oh my gosh, this could be amazing. And for them, is it difficult for them to express the empathy for folks who may be impacted? I keep thinking of imagine your house is in an area where a new highway is coming through, and half the population is so excited because this is going to cut my commute time down from an hour to 10 minutes, right? And there's lots of people who are super excited, but it directly affects you because your house is going to be demolished and you're going to have to move somewhere else. So how do you as a leader take that excitement that you're seeing for the future state and temper it with the empathy towards the folks who may be most affected?
Yeah, I mean, we do go through that a lot, right? Where different levels of the organization are going to experience something very different. And some are going to be really excited about it, and some are going to be very terrified or even just really sad about it. And so one of the things that I talk to our leaders about is, this comes down to understanding your team. And I think there are two levels of leader. There's kind of the frontline leaders that typically they've got, 10, let's call it 10 direct reports or less. And they can intimately know their team, right? And then you have the second level of leader, which is these people are directing large teams. They're leaders of leaders and sometimes leaders of leaders of leaders, right? And they have large teams. So you probably won't intimately know everyone on your team. But this is where, as a leader, as you're taking in the change and you're seeing your own excitement around it, it's really thinking about what are the personas that exist within my team? What experiences are each of these people going to have? Or at least these groups of people going to have? And is there something where I need to acknowledge that I'm excited by this and here's why, but I also understand that this might mean different things for other people on our team, and here are some things that I'm thinking about. And I talk a lot about coming with your backpack of support, and that's really important as a leader, especially with change and knowing what's happening in our brain, which I know we're going to get into more detail on in just a moment. But bringing that support to your people is so essential, because they don't necessarily have to know that this is exactly what's going to happen or here's what it's going to mean for me. But just simply knowing that a leader is bringing with them the support to say, I realize that this might impact you in a different way, and I'm here to figure that out with you. I'm here to listen. I'm here to understand, and I will do everything I can to make sure that we address that, or that we're helping to build that competence back, or whatever that might look like. And so always thinking about that backpack of support and having that on as a leader is really critical to how we support our teams and our people going through change.
That is a good perspective to have. So let's just jump in this, because honestly, I learned more about the whole brain function than I ever thought I would from your book. So I appreciate that. So your book introduces 6 neurological barriers that show up in almost every change effort. Before we go into each one, what makes these neurological versus just behavioral?
It's a great question, and I think it's really insightful. In my perspective, the behavior is what you see. The neurology is the behind the scenes foundation of why it's happening. And so I think they're tied together very closely. And that's why I think a lot of people would ask that same question, like, what makes them different? I don't think they are. I really do think the neurology drives the behavior, and the behavior is just what we see on the outside, right? But it's all based in that neurology and the way that we are actually wired within our brains.
So we've got I'll go through the six real quickly, just kind of list them off, and maybe you can kind of give me some examples of what this might look like when a change happens and what gets affected there. So the first one was the basal ganglia. The second one's the prefrontal cortex. The second one is the anterior cingulate cortex. I love all these very long names. The anterior cingulate cortex. So you have the anterior and the whatever. Anyway, the amygdala and the limbic system. So you have all these parts of the brain, and each one appears that it reacts slightly differently to either protect or understand what's going on. Can you kind of guide us through maybe something quick on each one of those?
Yeah, absolutely. So basal ganglia, this is my favorite. I usually tell everyone they can blame everything on it because it's foundationally what makes change difficult. It houses our routine and our habits. So the example you used with, driving to work, that's become routine. You know how to do it. You do it every day. You don't need to think about it. And the whole point of the basal ganglia is that if you had to think about every time you tied your shoes, we wouldn't get very far in a day because we would exhaust ourselves pretty quick, right? So it's really conserving as much energy as possible, hard coding what's successful, and just letting you repeat that every single day. Prefrontal cortex, when you move out of the actual automated day in and day out routines, you have to engage your prefrontal cortex, which has most of your executive functioning in it, and your logical thinking, your critical thinking. And you have to engage that because learning requires critical thinking. And so it's the opposite side of the spectrum from the basal ganglia, whereas that's where your energy oftentimes goes in the brain, is that you're critically thinking, logically thinking, all of those things. So when you move from habit to learning something new, it's a lot more exhausting, kind of what we were talking about with the driving example. And then you get into what I'd call the protective side of the house, which is, you have exclusion, which activates that anterior cingulate cortex. And what that's really doing is it's essentially bundling examples of pain. And your brain sees social pain, physical pain, all of that as kind of the same thing. And so it reacts the same way. So, if you've ever walked into a room and it became really quiet really quick, that's going to set off some alarms. And you're like, am I even safe in this room? I thought I trusted these people. It starts to do that. And it's really about your brain looking at it and saying, okay, if I'm excluded, what does that mean? And if you go all the way back to thousands of years ago, being part of the group was so essential to our survival that it became something that we were extremely nervous about as a brain, to make sure that we were being included, because exclusion usually meant death for most cases, because we couldn't survive alone. And so that's really what's going on in our brains as we feel that exclusion. Change by its nature is exclusionary. It's not something that we pull in 80,000 people into to make decisions. Ambiguity, once again, you've got your anterior cingulate cortex, and that ambiguity creates this need to create narratives in our brains. It's our rumor mill that we see at companies all the time, right? We don't have enough information. We fill in the blanks. We make up a story. We go talk to someone else. They've also made up a story. And then we bring that together in a narrative. Whether it's true or not doesn't really matter. It's what we believe. And 9 times out of 10, it veers to the negative because our brain's trying to decide if we're threatened. If you think about anxiety and our amygdala is, really a cool area of the brain. It really does create a lot of problems for us. But it's your fight or flight response. It's, are we safe? Do I need to figure out if we're safe? And so that anxiety of the unknown really creates problems, especially through change, where we don't know everything hardly ever. And then beyond that, we usually only think about people in the work context. And anxiety can be in every aspect of someone's life, right? So we don't know where anyone is actually on the scale of, fight or flight response. And then finally, the limbic system, which is our loss processing. And I simplify it to the limbic system because that involves the most areas. And quite frankly, the limbic system touches almost every area of the brain that we just talked about. It's a highly connected system, and loss affects almost every area of the brain and your body and everything. So it was hard to really distill that down into a singular system. But yeah, it's really about how we process loss, how we move through loss, and we already talked about a couple examples at work, but everything that we do has some impact on competence, relationships, or control, and that's constantly being challenged through change.
I like the way you bring some of the stuff together because when I think of change at work, I wouldn't necessarily jump to loss as one of the things I would think about, but the way you put it together, it makes a lot of sense. So I really appreciate the way you kind of connected those things. And then what you mentioned before about anxiety and not knowing, we all have lives. And what's outside of the work resource? Hey, we're all a resource at work, and we do the role that we've been given at work and we contribute in that way. But the reality is we're not machines. There's a lot more to each of us that's outside of the work context that perhaps weighs on us differently. So when that change comes through, it may be interpreted very differently depending on what your external color is of your real life versus your work life, right?
Absolutely.
So you've done this with hundreds of organizations. What separates the ones that are able to successfully adopt change? And if you want to tailor that to AI change, I'd love to hear your specifics on that. From the ones that stall, or the ones that kind of peter out through their process.
Yeah, I think from what I've seen, organizations that are really successful don't necessarily have less resistance. I think that's a common misconception that I hear a lot. People are like, well, what makes that company less resistant? And my answer is always, I don't think there is less resistance. It's just they have a better relationship with it. They've started to look at it in a different way. So the biggest pattern that I see is that organizations that stall tend to look at resistance as a problem that they're overcoming, or they bucket it into that's an issue. We're not going to even deal with it. We're just going to deal with the people that are excited and that are ready to take this on. And so they really move away from it. And the organizations that I think succeed far and wide is they're the ones that are curious. They're the ones that say, where is it showing up? Where's resistance at in our organization? And what does it tell us about that team? I use the analogy, they treat it like a check engine light. It doesn't necessarily mean that that's the problem, but it means that you need to start asking questions about what the problem actually is. And then the second difference that I see within those organizations that are looking at it as a check engine light is that they really have a good understanding of what I call pacing, which is, successful organizations understand that announcing change is not the same as absorbing it. And they build in the time for people to build new habits, to learn new systems, to ask questions, to practice. They lower that risk bar. And so that's kind of how I see successful companies showing up in this space. If we think about the AI transformation revolution that we're in right now, I don't even know if we can call it transformation. I feel like it has to have a bigger word. The thing that I'm seeing right now that is really interesting to me, and especially as someone who works in change, is the way that we're approaching it. And one of the things that I've likened it to is, a lot of us companies have said, go play. Like, we're going to give you all the tools, go play, show us where the efficiency is, like, be innovative, like, come back with a new process or come back with this new thing that you can do. And a lot of the conversations I've been having, especially with the brain in mind, is, that's not actually a great way that we as people take in innovation or play with new things. And I've likened it to walking up to someone and asking for a bank account and a PIN number. And that person is most likely going to be very stunned and be like, why are you asking for that? And the reality is that there's two roads, right? One is it's incredible and I just wanted to deposit money into your account. The other one is it's horrible and I just wanted to steal all your money. AI, in the way that we're approaching it, does the same thing, where we're saying, go play with it. But every worker is looking at that and going, this is either the technology or the thing that's going to make my career and make it incredible and propel me forward, or it could destroy it. it could, take my job. It could be something that I don't even want people to know that AI can automate this, because that's 90% of what I do, right? And so you have this really, really tense position between those two spaces. And that's why saying go play doesn't really work for us as humans. And the organizations that I think are starting to, I think there's several that are really starting to see that. But what they're doing differently when they see it is that they're starting to look at things from a let's solve a problem together. And I think it goes back to that empathy and that vulnerability of leaders to say, here's something we're really trying to redefine with AI. Let's do that. Let's hack it. Let's figure out how we might be able to do it. And you know what? Let's make it a contest. Like, whoever can create the most effective or efficient workflow, like, we're going to feature it. And then that's how we're going to move forward together. And so it doesn't feel so like you're looking at your own self and saying, here's all the ways that I'm inefficient and how AI can make it better. You're looking at the company and saying, here's the problem we're trying to solve. Let's figure out how we can do it. And it still creates that togetherness. It still creates that feeling of, we're all moving in a direction, rather than spot checking and saying, well, is Michael efficient, or is AI more efficient than Michael? And that's a very scary space for one person to be in.
Yeah, I would agree. So you mentioned something that kind of brought me back to one of the things you mentioned earlier. So when you have these organizations that are able to accept change and that togetherness that you just talked about, in my mind, what it brought me back to is thinking that a lot of these startups, change for them is tomorrow. We need to pivot our entire company tomorrow because of what we're learning or what we're seeing or the market space change or whatever the issue is. But because they're in a smaller group and they are all together, those decisions and those realizations kind of come together in that group. When you have an organization that's made up of 3, 10, 20,000 people, it's probably not going to have the same feel. Well, it won't have the same feel that you have when you're all in the same room, sharing a pizza together, right? So when we have that, is there a way to design change in these extremely large organizations in a way that feels safe or is inclusive, kind of like we've seen with the smaller startup companies who are able to quickly adapt and change as part of a community viewpoint?
There are a lot of ways to do it. I think they're not easy. They come down to culture too, which I think that could be a whole nother 5-hour long conversation that we could have, Michael, on culture itself. But I may
take you up on that, by the way.
I would love it. We should do it. So the problem with, I think, change in the current environment that we have is that change requires a lot of trust in a culture. Most cultures haven't built the trust of doing change well to be able to get people to act as they do in a startup. Where a startup, you like you said, you're a small group, you trust everyone around you, like, we're all moving together. That one false move isn't going to be a like you're fired kind of moment. It's we're failing fast, we're iterating, it has that culture kind of built into it because the trust is easy to build in small groups, right? When you have a large company, it's harder to build that trust that, okay, this change is happening. I'm nervous about it, but I don't know that I feel psychologically safe to say I'm nervous. And also, I don't know if I feel that I have the support that if I made the mistake, that it's not going to be an you're out the door, because it feels more like a numbers game, right? You've got 80,000, 100,000. When I was at Google, I think we were 175,000. Like, that doesn't feel safe when you have that many people and that people are, looking to join that organization. So it comes down a lot to trust and building that over time. But the way that you start that process is by creating some of the mechanisms that I do talk about in the book. But the biggest thing is creating narratives around change. What does it mean? Where are we trying to drive towards? And how do these seemingly disparate things come into that bucket And then the other piece that is really, really important is creating some form of transparency and frequency in how you're engaging your people. So we do this really, really poorly. Just every company does this poorly. But one of the things that is so critical, and we oftentimes just throw it to the side, is that frequency. We oftentimes don't have frequent meetings about specific things that need to be talked about on a frequent basis for people to feel safe, to feel and trust what's happening. And, we've all been there where we're like, okay, we have a daily or weekly stand up. And for 2 weeks, you talk about the thing that's top of mind. And then the third week it falls off because it's not the current top of mind or it's not there. That infrequency creates anxiety, and anxiety kind of pushes against trust, right? So it's really critical to make sure that you're engaging people in a frequent, transparent way and creating those narratives so people continue to anchor back in, here's where we're going, here's what that means. And I know I'm hearing a little bit about it every week, even if it's not new, it's just we're still anchoring in that. By the way, we're still moving in this direction. Nothing new to share, but any questions? Those 2 minutes of your daily stand-up can be the difference between trust and distrust for a long time.
Yeah, I can certainly see that for sure. All right, so for our last question here, what's the one mindset shift that you want every leader to walk away from after reading Rethink Resistance?
So for me, I think it comes down to stop treating resistance as an enemy of change, and really start treating it as information. And that's really hard for leaders. And one of the things I've said before is there's ego in leadership. And I don't think we like to acknowledge that, but there is. And it's required. It's not a bad thing. Like, ego's not a bad thing until you take it too far, right? But there is something about that ego that gets hurt during a change process, because as leaders, we want people to rally behind us. And change is never going to really have a rallying point in that initial moment. And so a lot of leaders react in that moment and say, is it me? Is it my vision? Do they just not get it? What is it? And then they push really hard. And that's where things go poorly. So thinking of that resistance as information rather than an enemy is the core of what I hope leaders walk away from the book. And I think it's really something that if you lean into it, it can tell you so much about your team, and it can actually build moments where you can connect with them on a much deeper level and build a much stronger bond with your team, where maybe the next time you do announce change, you've built enough trust that they will cheer, they will rally behind you right away. Because they say, Michael has done this 3 times. Every time he's delivered, every time he's thought about us and considered us, and we can very quickly get past that natural resistance because we've built trust in this team, and we know that that's going to happen again. So that would be the biggest thing for me. And I think it'd be a wonderful, wonderful world if we build that trust someday.
I would definitely agree with it, and we'll talk more about that when we talk about culture in our next get together. Okay.
I love it.
Well, Travis, it's wonderful talking with you today. I will leave a link to the book in the show notes for everyone to read, but thank you again for joining us today and kind of going through this. This was valuable. I love the book, and I've already recommended it.
Thank you so much for having me. It was great to be here, and I look forward to the next conversation.
Thanks for listening to Transform Now, the podcast from SS&C. You can find all of our episodes on your favorite podcast channel, as well as YouTube. To stay on top of the hottest topics in the world of agentic automation, subscribe now. The future of work is here.